Welcome to another deep dive into the darkest corners of the Fallout universe. I'm glad you're here, because what I'm about to tell you changes everything you thought you knew about the Wasteland. Today, we're investigating a conspiracy that's been hidden for 2 centuries. What if the Great War never actually ended? Everyone believes the nuclear exchange lasted 2 hours on October 23rd, 2077. China and America destroyed each other, and both governments died in the fire. But what if that's exactly what they wanted you to think? Chinese submarines still operational after 200 years. Chinese intelligence bases maintained long after the bombs. The Enclave appearing simultaneously across an entire continent with resources that shouldn't exist. The Brotherhood of Steel coordinating across thousands of miles despite total isolation. The institute developing technology that rivals pre-war military research. Every major faction in the Wasteland serving the same function, maintaining the same balance, preventing the same outcome, peace. This isn't coincidence. This is design. This is evidence of a shadow war that's been prosecuting itself for 2 centuries, using all of us as pawns in a conflict we never knew we were fighting. And if you genuinely enjoy this kind of dark storytelling, consider subscribing and liking the channel, but only if you like the content, because there are more secrets buried in the Wasteland than you can imagine, and someone needs to dig them up before the ghosts of the old world bury them again. I need you to listen. I need someone out there to understand what I've found before they find me. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is the truth I've uncovered, buried under 2 centuries of lies and misdirection. They told us the Great War lasted 2 hours, October 23rd, 2077. The bombs fell. China and America destroyed each other in a brief nuclear exchange that scorched the earth and ended civilization as we knew it. That's what everyone believes. That's what I believed for years, as I scavenged through the ruins, as I watched settlers struggle to build something from nothing, as I listened to the old ghouls tell their stories of the day the sky caught fire. But they lied to us, all of them. The Great War never ended. It's been going on for 200 years, right under our noses, and we've all been pawns in a conflict we didn't even know we were fighting. I know how this sounds. I know you're thinking I've lost my mind, that the radiation finally cooked my brain, that I'm just another Wasteland conspiracy theorist seeing patterns in the chaos. But I have proof. I've seen things, found things, that don't make sense unless you accept one terrible truth. The powers that started the war, both of them, they survived. They're still out there. They're still fighting. And every faction, every settlement, every so-called independent group in this Wasteland has been dancing on strings pulled by ghosts from the old world. Let me start with something simple, something you can verify yourself if you're brave enough or foolish enough to look. The Chinese submarine in Boston Harbor, the Yangtze. Most people who've seen it think it's just another relic, another piece of pre-war junk rusting away in irradiated water. Some kid near the Shamrock Tap House talks about a sea monster. People laugh, but that submarine is operational. 200 years after the bombs fell, and it still has power, still has functional systems, still has a ghoulified captain who's been waiting all this time. Captain Zhao. I met him, talked to him. He told me he fired his missiles on October 23rd, following orders from Chinese Naval Command. He struck a mine, got stranded, and his reactor leak turned him and his crew into ghouls. That's his story. That's what he wants you to believe. But here's what bothers me. Here's what kept me awake for weeks after that conversation. His submarine still works, not just the lights or some basic systems. The reactor can be fully repaired. The weapons systems are intact. The navigation equipment is functional. This isn't a derelict. This is an active military vessel in standby mode. 200 years. Think about that. 200 years of saltwater corrosion, radiation exposure, and zero maintenance. And yet with just a few replacement parts, the entire submarine can be restored to operational status. That's not possible unless someone designed it to last, unless someone planned for a very long war. And he's not alone. There's another Chinese submarine off the coast of Point Lookout, the SSN-371A. I found documents about it, classified files that somehow survived the war in military installations that should have been looted clean decades ago. This submarine was on a surveillance mission before the war. It sank. The US military was trying to recover it when the bombs fell. But here's the thing. The recovery operation had fresh supplies. The security was still active. Chinese intelligence was still trying to destroy it to keep the Americans from analyzing its technology. Fresh supplies, 2 centuries after the war, active security protocols, intelligence operations that never stopped. What do you think really happened here? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd like to know if I'm the only one who feels this way. I started digging deeper after Point Lookout. That place is a nightmare for other reasons, but while I was there, I found the Homestead Motel, Room 1D. There was a terminal inside with instructions, coordinates, passwords, the whole setup for a Cold War spy operation, dead drops, encoded messages, safety deposit boxes in the local bank. This wasn't just old equipment left behind. This was an active intelligence network, maintained and updated long after the bombs fell. The mission briefing was clear. Agent Zhang was ordered to destroy the submarine before the Americans could analyze it. Agent Yang had the self-destruct codes. The entire operation was sophisticated, professional, and designed to continue functioning even without direct oversight from command. This is how deep state intelligence networks operate, with redundancy, with autonomy, with the expectation that the war would go on, and it did go on. These agents, these ghoulified remnants of the People's Liberation Army, they stayed at their posts. They continued their missions for 200 years, but the Chinese weren't the only ones who survived. That's when I found Mama Dolce's. On the surface, it looks like any other pre-war industrial site, a food processing plant. Factories like this are scattered all over the wasteland, picked clean by scavengers, inhabited by raiders or super mutants or feral ghouls. Nothing special, except Mama Dolce's was never just a food processing plant. It was a Chinese intelligence front, multiple locations, from Morgantown to Arlington, all operating under the cover of an all-American business. They shipped weapons into the country, disguised as food shipments. They ran propaganda radio stations. They coordinated infiltration operations. And beneath the Morgantown facility, they built the Fujinia intelligence base. I've been inside. The bunker is massive. Research labs, manufacturing facilities for Liberator robots and stealth technology, barracks for special operations forces, communication arrays, and most importantly, terminals with operational data that was being updated right up until the moment the bombs fell. This wasn't just a spy outpost. This was a command and control hub for an invasion force. The cover story was Operation Trinitite. The Chinese were supposed to be targeting factory cities and nuclear silos in West Virginia. But here's what the terminals revealed. They failed to find the factory cities because the intelligence was wrong, deliberately wrong. Someone fed them false information. Someone wanted them to set up shop in West Virginia for a quite different reason. After the war, the Enclave found them. Not immediately, not during the chaos of the first few years, but eventually, Enclave operatives stormed Mama Dolce's. They killed the Chinese soldiers who had held out for decades. They took over the facility. They acquired the stealth technology and the robot manufacturing capabilities. And then, they used the same tactics the Chinese had used. They posed as survivalists. They spread rumors about ghosts and invisible killers to keep people away. They maintained the facility in secret, just like the Chinese had done. Why? Because both sides needed the war to continue. Both sides needed the infrastructure. Both sides needed the weapons. Both sides were still following the same strategic playbook that started the Great War in the first place. Now let me tell you about the Enclave, because this is where the conspiracy gets truly terrifying. Everyone knows about the Enclave, the remnants of the US government, the president, and the Joint Chiefs who evacuated to the oil rig off the California coast before the bombs fell. A few hundred survivors, maybe 1,000 at most, hiding on a platform in the Pacific Ocean while the rest of America burned. They emerged decades later with power armor and vertibirds, and tried to exterminate all mutated life so they could reclaim the continent. The Chosen One destroyed their oil rig in 2242. The Brotherhood of Steel crushed them on the East Coast in 2277. By 2287, they're basically extinct, just scattered remnants and bitter memories. That's the story. That's what everyone believes. But let me ask you something. How does a faction of a few hundred people, isolated on an oil rig with no significant manufacturing base, produce multiple suits of advanced power armor, dozens of vertibirds, energy weapons, and enough ammunition and supplies to wage war on two fronts across an entire continent? How do they have bases in California, in the capital Wasteland, in Chicago, all communicating and coordinating without any of them knowing the others existed until after the oil rig was destroyed? How does the presidential line of succession continue for 200 years, with multiple presidents taking office and governing according to constitutional protocols, unless the government was much, much larger than they claimed? The oil rig wasn't the whole enclave. It was just one installation, one very visible installation that everyone focused on, while the rest of the government continued operating from dozens of other hidden facilities. Raven Rock in the capital Wasteland, the congressional bunker at the White Spring in Appalachia, the presidential bunker rumored to be somewhere in the Midwest. These aren't backup facilities. These are continuity of government installations designed to keep the United States operating even after total nuclear devastation. And they did. They've been operating this whole time. Think about it. The Enclave in Appalachia had access to nuclear launch codes. They had satellite uplinks. They had MODIS, an artificial intelligence designed to ensure the continuation of American government operations. And what was Secretary Eckhart's plan? To continue the war against China, to use the nuclear weapons they still controlled to finish what they started. He failed. Internal conflict killed him and most of his people, but the infrastructure remained, the satellites remained, the communication networks remained, and somewhere out there, other Enclave installations were still following their mission parameters. Maintain continuity of government, preserve American sovereignty, eliminate the communist threat. The oil rig was a decoy. It had to be, because when you look at the timeline, when you track the movements and the communications, the Enclave is too big, too organized, too well supplied to be just a handful of survivors on a platform in the ocean. They had to have had access to mainland facilities, to supply depots, to manufacturing centers. They had to have had thousands of personnel, not hundreds, all following a chain of command that stretched back to before the war. And if the American government survived in that kind of scale and secrecy, maintaining military operations for 2 centuries, then what about the other side? What about China? The submarine in Boston Harbor is still operational. The submarine off-point lookout had a mission. The intelligence base under Mama Dolce's was still being supplied and maintained years after the bombs fell. Chinese Special Operations Forces, still in position, still following orders, still believing they were fighting for the People's Republic. But who was giving those orders? I found something in the Fujinia intelligence base, a transmission log, encrypted, but I managed to crack it with some pre-war decryption software I pulled from an old military terminal. The log showed regular communications between the Fujinia base and other sites. Not just before the war, after. For years after, the last log transmission was dated 2097, 20 years after the bombs fell. Someone in China, or someone claiming to represent China, was still sending orders to infiltration teams in America. Someone was still coordinating intelligence operations. Someone was still prosecuting the war. And if they survived for 20 years, who's to say they didn't survive longer? Who's to say they're not still out there? I started cross-referencing everything I could find. Every terminal entry, every holotape, every scrap of intelligence data from pre-war and post-war sources. And the more I looked, the more patterns I found. Patterns that suggest both governments not only survived the Great War, but planned for it, prepared for it, and structured their continuity operations to ensure the war would never truly end. The Vault experiments, for instance. Everyone knows Vault-Tec ran horrible experiments on the Vault populations, behavioral control, disease exposure, isolation studies. It was monstrous. But why? The official story is that the Vaults were supposed to be social experiments to prepare for space colonization or some other grand project. But here's another explanation. Intelligence gathering. You want to know how populations respond to different stressors? You run controlled experiments. You want to test behavioral modification techniques? You need test subjects. You want to see what happens when you expose large groups to FEV or radiation or psychological manipulation? You build vaults. The Enclave had access to all the Vault-Tec data, all of it, every experiment, every result, every bit of information on how to control, manipulate, and engineer human populations. That's not data you collect for rebuilding civilization. That's data you collect for waging war, for counterinsurgency, for population control in occupied territories. And the Chinese? They had the Shi in San Francisco, descendants of a submarine crew who made it to shore and built their own society. But the Shi aren't just survivors. They're organized. They're technologically advanced. They've maintained Chinese language and cultural identity for 200 years in the middle of what used to be America. And they're not the only Chinese survivors. There are ghouls throughout the Wasteland who refuse to talk about their pre-war lives, who still speak Chinese when they think no one's listening, who watch and wait and never quite integrate with the other survivors. Are they just remnants, traumatized refugees from a lost world, or are they sleeper agents, waiting for activation codes that might never come? Or worse, waiting for codes that have already come? I'm running out of time. The people I've shown this evidence to, they've disappeared, vanished. No bodies, no traces, just gone. I don't know if it's the Enclave, or the Institute, or the Chinese, or something else entirely. But someone doesn't want this information getting out. Someone wants us to keep believing the war ended in 2077. Someone wants us to stay blind to the fact that we're still fighting it. The Brotherhood of Steel. Everyone thinks they know what the Brotherhood is. A military organization obsessed with hoarding technology, founded by Roger Maxson after he discovered the FEV experiments at Mariposa Military Base and broke away from the US Army. They preserved military discipline and structure through the apocalypse, spreading across the wasteland to collect and safeguard dangerous technology. That's the official history. That's what they tell recruits. But I started noticing things that don't add up, little details that become glaring contradictions when you look at them closely. First, the coordination. The Brotherhood has chapters across the entire former United States, California, Illinois, Montana, the capital Wasteland, the Commonwealth, and somehow, despite 2 centuries of isolation, despite the collapse of all communication infrastructure, despite having no way to maintain contact across thousands of miles of irradiated wasteland, they all follow the same organizational structure. They all use the same ranks. They all follow the same codex. They all have the same mission parameters. How? How does that level of organizational consistency survive 200 years of isolation without any contact between groups? Unless they weren't actually isolated. I found a satellite uplink station in the Commonwealth. Old technology, pre-war hardware that somehow still functions. It was being guarded by Brotherhood patrols, not just guarded, maintained. They had technicians working on it, running diagnostics, keeping it operational. When I asked one of the scribes what it was for, she got nervous and told me it was for detecting Institute teleportation signatures. That's a lie. The equipment is too old, too specialized. It's designed for long-range communication, military band, frequencies, encrypted transmissions, the kind of system you'd use to coordinate operations across continental distances. The Brotherhood has been in communication this whole time. All the chapters, all coordinating, all following orders from someone. And here's what really bothers me: the Maxson lineage. Roger Maxson founded the Brotherhood in 2077. His descendants have led the organization for 200 years. Roger Maxson, then his son, then his grandson, all the way down to Arthur Maxson, who took command of the East Coast chapter in 2283. 200 years of unbroken succession in one family. That's not normal. That's not how military organizations work, even when they try to establish dynasties. Someone, somewhere, has been ensuring that power stays in that family. Someone has been maintaining the legitimacy of that bloodline across generations. That requires documentation, record keeping, a system of verification that can confirm bloodlines across centuries. That requires infrastructure that shouldn't exist in the Wasteland unless it's not Wasteland infrastructure, unless it's continuity of government infrastructure. I think the Brotherhood of Steel isn't a breakaway faction. I think they're still part of the U.S. military. I think Roger Maxson's break from the army was theater, a cover story to create a parallel command structure that could operate independently while still following strategic directives from higher up the chain. Think about their mission: control all advanced technology, prevent it from falling into the wrong hands, keep dangerous weapons away from wastelanders and potential enemy forces. That's not the mission of a preservation society. That's the mission of a counterintelligence operation. That's area denial. That's preventing the enemy from acquiring strategic assets. The Brotherhood hoards technology, but they also catalog it. They record everything they find, every piece of pre-war tech, every weapon system, every piece of equipment. They maintain detailed records, and they transmit those records somewhere to someone. And their wars. Look at their wars. The Brotherhood fights the Enclave, but they only fight specific Enclave factions, the ones that went rogue, the ones that deviated from acceptable parameters. President Eden wanted to use modified FEV to exterminate all mutated life. The Brotherhood stopped him. Why? Because he was threatening to win the war. He was threatening to actually end it, to create a victor, to break the stalemate. That couldn't be allowed. The war has to continue. The Brotherhood fights the Institute, but only when the Institute starts replacing people, starts infiltrating positions of power, starts threatening to destabilize the balance. Not because synths are an abomination, because the Institute was getting too powerful, too independent, too close to establishing real control over the Commonwealth. Every Brotherhood campaign serves the same purpose: maintain the status quo, prevent any faction from becoming dominant, keep everyone fighting, keep the war going. And the NCR, the New California Republic, the largest, most successful post-war nation in the Wasteland, built from the survivors of Shady Sands, growing to encompass most of California and beyond. They have a government, they have an army, they have taxation and infrastructure, and all the trappings of a real nation-state. But who helped them get started? Who gave Vault 15 the all-clear signal to open? Who provided them with the GECK technology that let them turn the Wasteland into farmland? The Enclave had access to all the vault controls. The Enclave could send signals to any vault in the system. The NCR thinks they built themselves. They think they're independent. But I found documents suggesting the Enclave allowed them to develop, even encouraged it, because they needed a functioning society to eventually absorb back into the reformed United States. They needed test cases for post-war governance. They needed to see which models would work, and what happens when the NCR starts getting too successful, when they start expanding too fast, when they start threatening to actually unite the West Coast. Suddenly, they're at war with the Legion, Caesar's Legion, a brutal slave-holding empire built on the ruins of Arizona and New Mexico. They reject all technology. They crucify their enemies. They're led by a former follower of the apocalypse who supposedly read some old books about Rome and decided to build a new empire. That's the surface story. But Caesar's tactics, his strategic thinking, his understanding of asymmetric warfare and psychological operations, that's not something you learn from old books. That's something you learn from military intelligence training. Caesar uses dialectics. He understands Hegelian philosophy. He talks about synthesis emerging from conflict between thesis and antithesis. That's Chinese strategic thinking. That's Maoist theory. The idea that continuous conflict drives historical progress, that contradictions must be maintained and managed rather than resolved. What if Caesar wasn't just inspired by history books? What if he was recruited, trained, pointed at the NCR, and told to create a credible threat that would keep them from becoming too stable, too peaceful, too unified? The Legion keeps the NCR at war. The war keeps both sides focused outward instead of building inward. The conflict maintains perfect strategic tension, neither side able to achieve decisive victory, both sides locked in endless combat that consumes resources and prevents either from focusing on reconstruction. It's the same pattern everywhere. The Minutemen start rebuilding the Commonwealth, creating settlements, establishing trade routes. Suddenly, there are super mutant attacks, raider raids, institute infiltrations. Every time someone tries to build something lasting, something peaceful, a threat emerges to tear it down. And those threats aren't random. They're coordinated, they're timed, they're designed to prevent stability without causing complete collapse. I started looking at the super mutants. Everyone knows they're the result of FEV experiments. The Master created them on the West Coast. The Enclave experimented with FEV. Vault-Tec ran FEV trials. The Institute conducted FEV research. But here's what bothers me. The super mutants keep appearing. New strains, new populations. The Institute claims they stopped their FEV program in 2224. But super mutants are still showing up in the Commonwealth in 2287, strong, organized groups with access to weapons and tactical coordination. Where are they coming from? Who's making them? And why do they always seem to attack at exactly the right moment to prevent settlements from becoming too secure? I found an old military manual in a bombed-out Pentagon office. It was a counterinsurgency doctrine from the 2060 seconds. The language was chilling. It talked about maintaining controlled chaos, about ensuring no single faction could achieve dominance, about using proxy forces and irregular combatants to keep populations destabilized without direct military intervention. It talked about the long war, not a war measured in months or years, but in decades and centuries, a war of attrition where the goal isn't victory, but continuous engagement, where peace is the real threat, because peace allows the enemy to rebuild, to develop, to eventually challenge you again. That's what I'm seeing in the Wasteland. Controlled chaos, managed conflict, a system designed to keep everyone fighting, everyone struggling, everyone too busy surviving to ask questions about who's really pulling the strings. The Institute. Everyone fears the Institute, the boogeyman of the Commonwealth. They kidnap people. They replace them with synths. They conduct experiments on the surface population. They're technological gods hiding beneath the earth, pursuing some agenda that no one understands. But what if I told you the Institute was never independent? What if I told you they were part of the continuity of government system all along? The Commonwealth Institute of Technology, CIT, one of the most advanced research universities in pre-war America. They had contracts with the Department of Defense. They developed weapons systems. They worked on classified projects, the kind of institution that would absolutely be included in continuity of government planning. When the bombs fell, the CIT survivors retreated to the underground sections of the campus. They had an experimental reactor, they had laboratories, they had the infrastructure to survive, and they had mission parameters, research directives, projects they were supposed to complete, regardless of what happened on the surface. The synth program isn't about creating servants or perfecting humanity. It's about creating infiltration units, perfect spies that can't be detected, sleeper agents that don't even know they're agents, population replacement protocols that allow for complete social control without anyone knowing they're being controlled. Think about what the Institute can do. They can teleport. They can appear anywhere in the Commonwealth, take what they want, replace whoever they want, and vanish without a trace. That's not civilian technology. That's military technology. That's exactly the kind of capability a deep state operation would develop for covert operations and their targets. Who does the Institute replace? Mayors, settlement leaders, caravaneers, people in positions of influence and information flow. They're building an intelligence network. They're establishing control over the Commonwealth's social and economic infrastructure. If you've ever wondered what choice you would make in a situation like this, tell me in the comments. I'll be reading them. But they're not conquering. They're not taking over. They're just watching, recording, maintaining surveillance, like they're waiting for something, like they're gathering information for someone else. I broke into an institute terminal. Don't ask me how. What I found there was fragmentary, encrypted, but enough to piece together. The institute has been in communication with outside parties, transmitting data, receiving directives, not frequently, not obviously, but regularly enough to establish a pattern. Someone outside the Commonwealth is interested in what the institute is doing. Someone with the technical capability to communicate across long distances using encrypted channels that survive the electromagnetic pulse from the nuclear detonations. The kind of communication infrastructure only a government would have. And the FEV research, everyone thinks the Institute stopped that program because it failed, because they couldn't get clean enough DNA to work with until they stole Sean from Vault 111. But I found something in their old lab files, a reference to shared research protocols with an outside facility. Coordinates were listed, but encrypted in a way I couldn't crack. The Institute wasn't conducting independent research. They were part of a larger research network. Multiple facilities, all working on the same problems, all sharing data. That's how major scientific programs work. That's how the Manhattan Project worked. Distributed research sites, all coordinating toward a common goal. What if the FEV research never stopped? What if it just moved to other facilities? What if the supermutants appearing across the wasteland aren't accidents or holdovers from old experiments, but ongoing production from research sites that are still operating according to pre-war mission parameters? Biological weapons development. That's what FEV was originally designed for, creating super soldiers. But it also creates perfect area denial weapons. You release FEV in a region, you get super mutants. Super mutants make areas uninhabitable for normal humans. They prevent settlement. They prevent reconstruction. They maintain the wasteland. If you wanted to ensure a war never ended, if you wanted to keep a population perpetually struggling, you would need to prevent them from rebuilding. You would need to ensure they could never achieve stability. Super mutants do that. Raiders do that. Feral ghouls do that. And all three keep appearing, generation after generation, even when they shouldn't. Even when there's no logical source for new populations. I tracked a raider gang for 3 months, watched their movements, their supply lines, their recruitment. They were getting equipment from somewhere. Pre-war military hardware, not scavenged gear, new production, ammunition that showed no signs of age. Weapons that had been manufactured recently, using old military specs. Where did it come from? Raiders don't have manufacturing capabilities. They barely have agriculture. Yet somehow, they have assault rifles and combat armor and enough ammunition to wage constant war on settlements. Someone is supplying them. Someone is keeping them armed and dangerous. Someone needs them to keep attacking, keep destabilizing, keep preventing any real peace from taking hold. The evidence is everywhere once you start looking. Communication networks that shouldn't function but do. Supply chains that shouldn't exist but operate smoothly. Coordination between groups that have no reason to coordinate. Technology that appears in places it shouldn't be, maintained by people who shouldn't have the knowledge to maintain it. It's a machine, a vast, invisible machine built before the war and still running 200 years later, still following its programming, still prosecuting a conflict that was supposed to end in 2 hours but was designed to last forever. The Great War wasn't a failure of diplomacy. It wasn't an accident. It was the intended outcome. Both sides wanted it. Both sides prepared for it. Both sides built the infrastructure to ensure they could keep fighting long after the bombs fell and the cities burned and everyone else died. They didn't want peace. They wanted eternal conflict. Because conflict justified their existence. Conflict justified their power. Conflict meant they would always be necessary, and we're the ones paying the price. We're the ones dying in the wasteland, thinking we're fighting for survival, for resources, for territory, for ideology, not knowing that every fight, every battle, every war between factions is just another move in a game that was set up before we were born and will continue long after we're dead, unless someone stops it, unless someone exposes it, unless someone makes people understand that the real enemy isn't the raiders or the mutants or the opposite faction. The real enemy is the war itself, and the ghosts who keep it going. I need to tell you about the number stations before they cut my transmission, before whatever's been tracking me finally catches up. You ever tune your Pip-Boy radio to the far end of the frequency spectrum, past Diamond City Radio, past the classical station, past all the normal broadcasts? There's something down there, static, mostly. But within that static, if you listen carefully, there are patterns, repeating sequences, numbers read in monotone voices, both English and Chinese. Number stations, they existed before the war. Covert communication channels used by intelligence agencies to send encrypted messages to field operatives. One-way broadcasts that couldn't be traced back to the source. The messages meant nothing unless you had the cipher, just random numbers to anyone else. They're still broadcasting. 200 years later, someone is still sending those messages, and somewhere out there, someone is still listening, still decoding, still following orders that come through in sequences of numbers that mean nothing to the rest of us. I recorded hours of these transmissions. I ran them through every decryption algorithm I could find in old military terminals. Most of it stayed gibberish, but some of it broke open, and what I found made my blood run cold. Coordinates, dates, activation codes, supply drop locations, rules of engagement, all formatted in military communication protocols that match pre-war U.S. and Chinese systems. These aren't just old recordings playing on repeat. The messages change, they update, they respond to current events in the Wasteland. When the Brotherhood moved into the Commonwealth, the number stations changed their broadcast patterns. New frequencies activated, new message schedules. Someone was alerting operatives that a major player had entered the game board. When the Institute started their synth replacement program in earnest, different codes started appearing. Counterintelligence protocols, surveillance directives. Someone was coordinating a response. The war never stopped. It just went quiet. It moved into shadows and dead drops and encrypted broadcasts that no one was supposed to understand. And it's been running like that for 2 centuries, with field operatives who don't even know they're operatives, following conditioning that was burned into their minds before the bombs fell or passed down through generations of training they thought was just survival skills. I found one of them, an old ghoul living in a settlement near Grey Garden. He seemed normal at first, helpful even, taught people how to purify water, how to identify edible plants, how to set up defensive positions, basic wasteland survival knowledge. But I noticed things, the way he always positioned himself with sight lines to all entrances, the way he cataloged everything and everyone who passed through, the way he asked casual questions that weren't casual at all, building psychological profiles, identifying skills and weaknesses, mapping social networks. I confronted him late one night, asked him point blank who he was, working for. He looked at me with those dead ghoul eyes and smiled, said he didn't know what I was talking about, said he was just a survivor trying to help people survive. Then I spoke one of the activation phrases I'd decoded from the numbers stations. Just testing, just seeing if my theory held water. He went rigid, his eyes unfocused, and in a voice completely different from his usual tone, he started reciting a status report. Settlement population, resource levels, notable individuals, security vulnerabilities, everything you'd need to know to infiltrate or destroy the place. He gave me coordinates for a dead drop location where he'd been leaving written reports for decades. Then he blinked, came back to himself, and had no memory of what he'd just said. Manchurian candidates, Sleeper agents, programmed responders who live normal lives until the right trigger activates their conditioning. The intelligence services were developing this technology before the war. Psychological manipulation techniques designed to create deep cover operatives who didn't know they were operatives. How many are out there? How many helpful settlers, friendly traders, wasteland guides are actually intelligence assets, gathering information, filing reports, waiting for activation codes that might come through a numbers station broadcast? How many times have I talked to one without knowing it? The switchboard, that's another piece of the puzzle. It's an old intelligence facility in the Commonwealth, built by the Defense Intelligence Agency before the war. Deep underground, heavily fortified, filled with surveillance equipment and data processing systems. The Institute uses it now, or used to, before the railroad discovered it. But here's what bothers me about the switchboard. It's too big, too sophisticated, too well maintained for something that's supposedly been abandoned since the war. I got inside, past the turrets and the robots. The main computer systems were damaged, but auxiliary systems were still running, routing data, processing signals, connected to a network that extended far beyond the Commonwealth. Terminal logs showed activity from 2077 right through to 2287, continuous operation for 200 years. What was it processing? Where was the data going? The terminals wouldn't tell me. The encryption was military grade, and most of the files had been purged or corrupted, but I found fragments, references to SIGINT coordination, signals intelligence, references to asset tracking, and deep cover network maintenance. The switchboard was a node in a larger intelligence network, and that network is still operational, still collecting data from across the wasteland, still coordinating operations, still prosecuting the war. I think the aliens might even be involved. Stay with me here. The Zetans. Everyone who's encountered them knows they're real. They've been abducting people, conducting experiments, observing Earth. But why? What's their interest in our destroyed world? What if they're not aliens at all? What if they're deep reconnaissance units from one side or the other? Advanced technology, disguised as extraterrestrial to provide plausible deniability, operating from orbital platforms that survived the war, monitoring, intervening when necessary to maintain the balance. Think about their actions. They abduct people with valuable knowledge or unique capabilities. They conduct medical experiments. They study combat effectiveness. That's not scientific curiosity. That's military intelligence gathering. That's exactly what a government cut off from ground assets would do to maintain awareness of surface conditions and their technology. Yes, it's advanced, but is it really beyond human capability? Or is it just classified military research that was completed before the war? Directed energy weapons, cryogenic suspension, advanced aircraft, all of these things were being researched in the 2070 seconds. Who's to say they weren't perfected and deployed to orbital stations as part of the continuity of government protocol? I know how this sounds. I know I'm connecting dots that might not connect, but the pattern is there. Every major faction, every significant group in the wasteland, they all serve the same function. They all maintain the same equilibrium. They all prevent peace. The Shi in San Francisco descended from a Chinese submarine crew, but they're too organized, too technologically advanced to just be survivors. They maintained military discipline. They maintained Chinese cultural identity. They built a functioning society with advanced capabilities, and they just happened to occupy a strategically significant port city on the West Coast. Are they survivors, or are they an occupation force that's been waiting 200 years for reinforcement that never came, or reinforcement that did come, quietly, without anyone noticing? Hoover Dam, critical infrastructure, power generation for the entire region. The NCR wants it. The Legion wants it. Everyone fights over Hoover Dam. But here's something nobody talks about. There were Chinese operatives there before the war, infiltrators. How did they know Hoover Dam would be important 200 years later? How did they identify it as a strategic objective? unless they had intelligence about long-term war planning, unless they knew the war wasn't going to end in 2077, unless they were positioning assets for a conflict that was expected to last centuries. Every piece of evidence points to the same conclusion. The 2-hour nuclear exchange was just the opening move. Both governments survived. Both maintained their command structures. Both continued prosecuting the war through covert means, proxy forces, and strategic manipulation, and the radiation. Let's talk about the radiation. 200 years. That's how long it's been since the bombs fell. Radiation decays. We know this. We have pre-war data on half-lives and environmental recovery times. By 2287, most areas should be habitable. Background radiation should be manageable. The world should be healing, but it's not. Radiation is still intense in many regions. Hotspots that make no sense based on where the bombs fell. Areas that get more radioactive over time instead of less. Entire zones where nothing can live, where the rads keep climbing year after year. What if someone is maintaining the radiation? What if there are systems still operating, still releasing radioactive material into the environment, specifically designed to keep the wasteland a wasteland, to prevent large-scale agriculture, to prevent population growth, to ensure humanity stays weak, divided, struggling, area denial weapons. The perfect tool for a forever war. You don't have to actively fight if the environment does the fighting for you. You just have to maintain the environmental weapons, keep them running, keep them poisoning the land, and nobody even knows to look for them because everyone assumes the radiation is just leftover from the war. I found one. Pure luck, really. I was tracking a radiation storm, trying to get to shelter, and I saw something. A facility, half buried, that didn't match any pre-war construction I'd seen. It was generating an electromagnetic field, and at the center of that field was a device that was actively processing and dispersing radioactive material. I couldn't get close enough to examine it properly. The rads would have killed me in minutes, but I could see enough. It was sophisticated, purpose-built, and it was maintained. Someone or something had been servicing it, keeping it operational, ensuring it continued its function. There are probably dozens of these scattered across the wasteland, hundreds maybe, all working together to keep the world poisoned, to keep humanity from recovering, to maintain the conditions necessary for eternal conflict. If this story has kept you listening this far, and you want more of these dark confessions from the wasteland, hit that subscribe button. It tells me someone out there is still paying attention to warnings like these. The bottle caps. Even the economy is part of this. Who decided bottle caps would be currency? It seems random, organic, something that just emerged from barter necessity. But think about what bottle caps represent. A completely decentralized currency that can't be controlled by any government, that can't be inflated or deflated, that can be manufactured by anyone with access to bottling facilities. In other words, the perfect currency for maintaining economic chaos, for preventing any faction from establishing monetary control, for ensuring trade remains localized and fragmented, for keeping the wasteland economically divided. And who has access to bottling facilities? Who could produce bottle caps on an industrial scale if they wanted to? Any surviving industrial installation with power generation, any group with pre-war manufacturing knowledge, any organization that wanted to flood the market or create scarcity to manipulate regional economies. The whole system is designed. Every aspect of wasteland life that seems random or emergent is actually carefully maintained. The raiders are supplied, the radiation is sustained, the factions are balanced, the economy is managed, and nobody sees it because nobody looks up far enough to see the strings. I'm tired. I've been running for weeks now. Every time I stay somewhere too long, they find me. I don't know who they are. Institute coursers, maybe. Enclave operatives, Chinese infiltrators, Brotherhood paladins. It doesn't matter. They all serve the same function. They all protect the same secret. But I've left copies of everything I found, hidden in secure locations, encrypted and stored in terminals across the Commonwealth. If something happens to me, if I disappear, like the others, the information survives. Someone else can find it. Someone else can continue asking questions. Here's what I know for certain. The Great War never ended. It went underground, became invisible, transformed into a system that perpetuates itself through our ignorance. Both the United States and China survived as deep state entities. They've been fighting a shadow war for 200 years, using the Wasteland as their battlefield and us as their pawns. Every faction is compromised. Every leader could be a plant. Every helper could be an agent. The war is everywhere and nowhere. It's in the code of every terminal, the signal of every radio broadcast, the mission parameters of every organization that claims to be building a better future. And the truly horrifying part? We could rebuild. We could end this. The technology exists. The knowledge exists. There are enough good people, enough resources, enough hope to actually restore civilization, to heal the world, to end the suffering. But they won't let us. The machine won't allow it, because peace means someone won. Peace means the war is over. Peace means they're no longer necessary, and the one thing the machine cannot permit is its own obsolescence. So the war continues, will continue, forever if they have their way. An eternal conflict maintained by ghosts of the old world, fought by people who don't even know they're soldiers, for objectives nobody remembers, and victory that's never allowed. I found one last thing before I went dark. A terminal in an old military bunker, hidden so deep I don't think anyone's accessed it since before the war. It had a single file, marked with the highest security classification. The file was labeled Operation Eternal Vigil. I opened it. It was a strategic directive, dated October 1st, 2077, 3 weeks before the bombs fell. The directive was simple, chilling in its clarity. In the event of nuclear exchange with hostile powers, all continuity of government assets are hereby ordered to maintain operational status indefinitely. Primary objective is not victory, but sustained engagement. Peace negotiations are prohibited. Diplomatic solutions are prohibited. The conflict must be maintained until total enemy capitulation is achieved, regardless of time frame required. Authorization level, cardinal. No override authority exists. Compliance is mandatory. Both sides had the same directive. I'm sure of it. Operation Eternal Vigil on one side, some equivalent designation on the other. The same strategy, the same insanity, the same guarantee that the war would never end. They didn't want to win. They wanted to fight forever, because a forever war meant forever power, forever relevance, forever justification for their existence. And here we are, 200 years later, still fighting, still dying, still rebuilding only to be torn down again, still hoping for peace that will never come as long as the machine keeps running. I don't know if anyone will believe this. I don't know if it matters. The evidence is there for anyone brave enough to look. The patterns are visible for anyone willing to see. The truth is hidden in plain sight, scattered across 1,000 terminals and holotapes and radio broadcasts, waiting to be assembled by someone who asks the right questions. Maybe that someone is you. Maybe you're the one who finally breaks the cycle. Maybe you're the one who finds a way to shut down the machine and let humanity actually heal. Or maybe you're just another pawn, moving across the board according to programming you don't understand, serving purposes you were never meant to know. I guess we'll find out. This is my final transmission. If you're hearing this, I'm already gone. They found me. Or I found something I wasn't supposed to find. Something that finally convinced them I was too dangerous to leave alive. But the truth survives. In data caches, in hidden terminals, in the minds of everyone who listens to this and starts asking their own questions. The truth is a virus now. It spreads. It infects. It can't be contained. The Great War never ended. It's still happening, all around you, every day, in every struggle, and every sacrifice, and every death that seems senseless and random. It's not random. It's the machine. It's the war. It's the ghosts of the old world, still fighting battles they can't remember how to stop. And until we understand that, until we see the strings and cut them we'll never be free. The Wasteland isn't what destroyed us. We're still being destroyed, actively, deliberately, by forces that survived the apocalypse and decided eternal war was preferable to an uncertain peace. They made that choice for us, without asking, without explaining. They condemned generations to suffering and struggle and death, all to maintain a conflict that serves no purpose except its own continuation. That's the real horror of the Wasteland. Not the radiation, or the monsters, or the scarcity. It's that none of it had to be this way. We could have had peace. We could have had recovery. We could have had a future, but they took it from us, and they're still taking it every single day. Someone has to stop them. Someone has to end the war for real this time. Not just win it, but end the mechanism that perpetuates it. Destroy the machine, cut the strings, break the cycle. Maybe it's you. I hope it's you. Because if nobody does, if the machine keeps running, then we'll still be fighting this war 200 years from now and 200 years after that, forever. That's what Eternal Vigil means. Forever, unless someone finally says no, this is my testament, my warning, my plea. The Great War never ended. But maybe, just maybe, someone listening to this can finally end it. Good luck. You're going to need it.